few years back, I had a conversation with someone regarding horror movies. I'm a pretty big fan of horror movies, to the point where it's my go-to genre if I can't decide what to watch. I often start horror movies on streaming services, and after 10 minutes of watching, I say, shit, I've actually seen this one. And then I have to begin my movie search all over again, which is also a testament to how bad movie descriptions are on streaming services, but that's a conversation for another time. My conversation surrounding horror was based off a Reddit thread, or maybe a video essay. I think my source tells me from the other room that it may be from a piece about a potential Akira remake that turned into this particular concept. But anyway, the thesis of the thread, or article, or whatever it was about the difference between American and Japanese horror movies, and how they play with fear. Culture was sort of the answer. The writer made this cool point about Japanese horror movies and how they prey on the audience's fear of the city, because that's where their innocence was lost. And in American horror films, we see the fear emanating from the wilderness, because that's where Americans lost their innocence. If I recall correctly, that innocence portion of the argument was to illustrate that the evils of the world live in those locations for us. In Japanese culture, the city represented industry, growth, a sense of the unknown. And innocence, in essence, was lost after the atomic bombs, and their urban myths were solidified. Whereas for Americans, wilderness was terrifying because of discovery, lack of civilization, again, the unknown. This fear developed in the American colonization, thus rural myths. In Japanese horror films, even ones as simple as The Grudge, the entire film takes place in a bustling cityscape, where people are surrounded, but there's this lack of trust in others. The city meets ghost stories, culture shocks. It's scary, especially when you're like 13 or whatever. I'm just saying. Then, in American horror films, take a classic like Friday the 13th. You have a serial killer stalking people through the woods. I mean, hell, there's even an entire movie joking about American horror tropes. Cabin in the Woods. But American horror tends, not always of course, to lean on this fear of the unknown. The fear of something lurking in the dark, in a place where we're all unfamiliar and vulnerable. Whereas Japanese horror tends to lean on this evil invading our space through mistrust and trickery. In the last few years, we've sort of seen this resurgence of interest in a more niche horror genre though, folk horror. Like all horror genres, folk horror can be loosely interpreted, but in general, we can focus on English cultures. Not always, but the OGs certainly are. Landscapes, isolation, satanic or pagan rituals, and fire. Through some research, it's important to point out that these folklorically based stories are often skewing and manipulating moral and theological values, and placing an emphasis on violence, rituals, torture, and supernatural forces. The films rely on isolating their main characters, and in turn cause discomfort and unease for their audiences. Through silence and hesitant communication, vast landscapes that insinuate isolation, and earthy, overt sexuality that causes confusion. Folk horror seems to exist in two spaces, too. One in which the main character is undergoing a desire for escape from their modern life. In the film Midsommar, Dani has just endured a series of traumatic incidents in her modern home life. A trip to simpler times in rural Sweden seems like the perfect break. A way to get back to basics. A way to clear the mind and find some calm amongst the chaos. In other circumstances, we follow characters that are already involved in the questionable communities. In Robert Eggers is The Witch. Our main character is already deeply rooted in her family's ways and is searching for answers to the things that she questions. But in other circumstances, the fear rises from themselves. Where Japanese fear the intruders and Americans fear the unknown lurking behind the tree line, in folk horror, filmmakers are preying on our fear of ourselves. Our fear of our own cultures, humanity, ancestry, but all of that makes up who we are. Folk horror wants us to look inward and acknowledge the fear we have in ourselves. Finding a definition wasn't necessarily challenging for folk horror, but a problem arises where you're working through lists of movies for a genre and realize that some feel more like folk horror than others. They might fit the bill by the loosely defined threads online, but any filmmaker or writer can bend the rules, right? Genre doesn't need to be so solidly constructed. In general, there were a few common themes that I saw other people talking about, and some that I felt were worth mentioning. Here they are. 1. A belief system. Mostly an occult-leaning or paganist approach, or something similar. 2. Landscapes. The landscapes are used as this vessel to create isolation and beauty. 3. Quietness or silence, another aesthetic push to intensify discomfort. 4. Escapism. Lots of circumstances show audiences a character who needs to be enlightened, needs to take a break, or is looking for a change. 5. The cleanse it with fire mentality. Nearly all folk horror ends with a symbolic fire sequence that typically is used for sacrifice. 6. A summoning or reckoning. I think of this as the point in the film that acts as the rain in coming-of-age movies, the rain often symbolizing change and a shift in a character's mindset. Here, the summoning period often brings about this more overt danger. Number 7, sex and drugs. How very rock and roll. Leaning on earthy, carefree use of drugs and sex, the characters are often met with this sense of freedom or lack of social caring, which feels kind of off-putting. These themes are the general characteristics I looked for while watching these films over the last few weeks, but found that some seemed to veer a little too far off the path, which seemed to make it not a true folk horror. My general conclusion is that there's something deeper about what makes a movie folk horror. Part of it's execution, not just characteristics, and I tend to believe that the films were more rooted in what the fear was and how the characters used that fear. When examining a movie like The Wicker Man from 1973 by director Robin Hardy, we get one of the classics. If you were to quickly Google a list of folk horror movies, this one would nearly always come up, and probably be at the top. Even Ari Aster used it as his primary inspiration for Midsommar in 2019. The film follows a police officer who visits a closed-off society on an island to investigate a murder. He's met only with riddles, frustration, and a surprising confession of the occult. It's here, though, that audience members are met with isolation, as the officer is stranded on an island where his seaplane won't start. We see parades, public sexual acts, a reformation of common Christianity. And finally, we get our clean it with fire moment at the very end. I won't purposefully give away spoilers, but through the film, there are heavy leanings on the aforementioned themes. But what seems to truly bother Sergeant Howie in the film is how swayed he is by the culture, almost as if he's under some spell. The folky, alluring music hums in the distance, and he's nearly seduced by a young bartender and hotel worker. Sergeant Howie may stick to his guns, so to say, but what seemed so interesting was the intrigue he faced. Being a strong-willed Christian was almost not enough to save him from his desires and angst. The setting and the general themes played throughout the film in a unique and appealing way, calling back to simpler times. A callback to the homeland, which ends in a fierce hindsight bias. It's easy to look at the past and think, that seems great, and overlook what was bad, which felt like Sergeant Howie's sped-up experience. So much of the isolation was built upon the setting and the interactions with the other people and their spaces. When you get into a more modern folk horror movie, you'll find another popular one, The Blair Witch Project, from 1999. The movie was a sensation because of its unique found footage, faux documentary setup, and the film is often listed as a folk horror movie because of its ending. Admittedly, this movie has always been one that felt like it didn't quite match up with the genre properly for me, and I think a lot of that has to do with the atmosphere. There's nothing scenic about The Blair Witch Project. The film follows a bunch of people in their 20s trying to piece together a disappearance of their friend's sister. The boxes are checked on isolation, woodsy, earthy, satanic rituals, summoning, all of that. But what it lacks is a fear of oneself. There's no urge that any of these characters feel. There's no moment where they have to look in the mirror and decide who they really are. They're simply afraid of something. The evil presence is kind of enough. Don't get me wrong, it's a great movie. There's a reason it's a classic, but it just doesn't feel like folk horror, and I was never able to really put my finger on it previously. A film like Midsommar, which is essentially Ari Aster's love letter to Robin Hardy, feels too good. And it's so well executed. The movie follows Danny, who has recently lost her family in a tragic circumstance, and she follows her boyfriend to Sweden, where he's hoping to do his final project for his master's degree. Her boyfriend has been trying to break up with her for some time, which comes to haunt her in ways she didn't expect later. And weirdly on YouTube, everyone who does videos about Midsommar just thinks it's just one big metaphor for breakups, and I don't know, man. I don't know if I'm there. I don't love that theory. Anyway, the film shows Danny trying to escape her environment for a moment of cleansing relaxation. Her and her friends do drugs in a stunning field. The location is so beautiful, and Aster finds a way to make the entire location feel like it's breathing with you, which is like partly the drugs, while you hope to soak up the rays with Miss Danny. There's a hinted sexual tension between many characters in this nearly empty community, thus leading you to wonder about incest, like pretty immediately. And the further you get in the film, the further you recognize the manipulation, occult tendencies, and impending, doom. Yeah, doom. At some point, another visiting couple try to leave the compound only to be met with calming Swedish patrons telling them lies and making them feel like they're losing it. I think mostly people call that gaslighting, which is actually comes from a movie called, I think, Gaslight? I don't know, anyway. I remember watching this movie for the first time in theaters, pre-COVID. I went by myself and sat by a chatty local man. I watched his fingers grip the edge of the leather seats in tense anticipation. I could hear my neighbors breathing heavily and watch them grit their teeth. The tension that hung in the air from that film was more palpable than anything I've seen. To close out the movie, we get our film theme fire cleanse, and we begin to question Danny then. Is she into the culture? Is she giving in to keep herself safe? Is she okay? She's resisted and felt immensely claustrophobic throughout the trip. But after relying on a few women her age to help her get through a panic attack, she starts to wonder where her allegiance lies. She just lost her family. Is this her new family, this eerie community now? Midsommar is scary because of that. We sympathize with Danny the whole time we watch. And more so the second time. I have to admit that the first time I watched it, I felt a weird aversion towards Danny, and later on felt better about her when I watched it again. That's a side note. Then, when coming to the end, you can't help but think, well, what would I do here? Questioning yourself, your loyalties, and having a chance to face your true self is fucking terrifying. You can cut the word fucking out if you'd like. To keep with the modern folk horror movies, and because they're more accessible, we can look at movies like The Witch from 2015 by Robert Eggers, another film with densely packed and intensely curated environment. Here, we watch Thomasin and her family try to leave town in New England to make their own way in life and the community. Upon their leaving the town, they immediately meet failed crops, strange ongoings, and their youngest child even disappears.
Boo! Sam?
Thomasin is immediately blamed for the disappearance. The family have confined themselves, and with their disengagement, they've cut themselves from all people and normalcy, which is replaced with an unstoppable force and familial stress. Following our themes, there's a religion within the family. Thomasin is accused of being a witch by her siblings, which is a relevant topic for the time period of this piece.
Mother and Father will find out. What? That you are a witch.
Or at least would be soon. There does exist a rise of occultism, and the fire cleanse comes on strong eventually, which leads to the rise of the summoning. The family is quite literally isolated because of their desire to escape. They land in a scenic, woodsy place where Americans tend to find fear and uncertainty. But what's really fascinating about this film is that we start to develop a hesitancy to trust the family over and over again. They can't back up their oldest daughter, Thomasin, ever, and she's berated and accused of more than even makes any sense. This movie has a slow build with an intensity that feels familiar and nerve-wracking. And Thomasin faces her moment where she must question her sanity and look inward towards the end, where she needs to make a choice about her future. Thomasin fears her family, fears her lack of control of her life and her truth, so when offered to live deliciously, the answer reaches her lips quickly.
Yes.
One of my other favorites is called Apostle, from 2018 by director Gareth Evans. The movie feels almost a little confusing at the start, as you start by following a character named Thomas, who travels to an idyllic land where a religious cult resides. His sister's been kidnapped and kept there, and Thomas intends to find and rescue her with any means necessary. Thus results an onslaught of severe violence, but the movie feels pretty time appropriate. While less beautiful than locations we've seen elsewhere, we get a glimpse of this perfection and solidly established society, one that will accept anyone who needs to run from their previous life. When Thomas arrives on the island, he and the others are asked to divulge their crimes. It's insinuated most have crimes under their belts, and that the community is willing to overlook those problems, with religious affiliation likely. Thomas searches and finds himself among a giant conspiracy within the community that's been hidden and covered up, involving death, occult properties, sacrifices, and corruption. Normal community problems, obviously. His sister has been held, and will eventually be another sacrifice in order to maintain the crops. Fury, violence, and unhappiness surface as well, the more everything becomes unveiled. This film feels like it hits all the points on the list for themes, but doesn't make the audience or the characters really question themselves. They persevere no matter what. And while it, by definition, is a folk horror, it misses the mark for me in some ways because it lacks the internalization and terror in oneself. It feels more like Little House on the Prairie meets Saw. In a good way, of course. It's extremely entertaining and appalling in its own really beautiful way. There are plenty of other examples of this genre and how it can work, how it doesn't work nearly as well. As stated previously, genres are meant to have the rules be broken. It's meant to be pliable in its execution, but what I find to be the most successful is the fear that helps us to look inward at ourselves. A reflective and familiar terror is the one that will sit heavily on our chests at night as we try to fall asleep and cause us to stir as we think it through multiple times before watching the film again. It's the reason I've seen Midsommar so many times. It's the reason I'll think of The Wicker Man when I think of folk horror. Or while I'll argue that Hereditary could be considered a folk horror film, instead of talking about the Blair Witch Project. It's how the movie hits, how it stays with you because it affects you on a deeper and more emotional level. And because of that, I think that folk horror finds success and power when it plays with the fear we have in ourselves as audiences and pushes that out in a variety of themes that are useful and evocative.